Last week we finished off our summer series on those latter prophets, the last 12 books of the Old Testament, and finished off with Malachi. And Malachi ends basically with God saying to them, I've done about all I can do with you guys. I've tried and tried and tried, and you're no better than you ever were. I'm not going to say anything more. Next thing you're going to see is the messenger come that will prepare the way for the Lord who's going to come. And he says, by the way, if you're in this condition, that's not going to be good news for you. But that's where we left off. We are going to keep going right on through the Bible and pick it up with the Gospels now, and that messenger that's coming and the Lord who is coming, as we start out going through the Gospel of John. And what we're going to look at today is really the prologue to the Gospel of John. The Gospels all have prologues, every single one of them, and they're kind of interesting when you look at them. Matthew's prologue, before he gets into the Gospel, is a genealogy that begins with Abram and goes right on down through Jesus Christ to show that when you get to Jesus Christ, the Old Testament is just continuing. You know, this sharp break we like to make between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That prologue says, no, there's no break there. This is God's continued plan, his continued work right in line. And then he gets into that. When you get to the Gospel of Mark, he starts with the prophecies of Malachi and Isaiah that say the messenger is going to come to prepare the way, and then the Lord will come. And then he gets into the gospel. Luke's kind of interesting prologue goes back to the apostles who wrote the previous two gospels, which would have been Matthew and Mark, and says, some others have written this, and there's a little bit of confusion going on, so I have studied this carefully, that I can lay this out so you can know exactly what the truth is. And he wrote the Gospel of Luke, which is in agreement with both Matthew and Mark. And then we get to the Gospel of John. It was written much later, and it is much different than the other three Gospels, which are very similar. They have very much the same stories and the same way of telling them, although there are differences. But John is quite a bit later, and it doesn't touch too many of those stories, but adds a lot of other things that the other Gospel missed. And John is really trying to do something very specific in his Gospel. He is presenting Jesus in such a way that when you hear what he has to say, you will believe in him. It's really all about who Jesus is, which is what all these Gospels are about. But John's prologue, well, let's just start in the Gospel of John. If you have your Bibles, John 1:1 starts out the first three words, in the beginning. By the way, is that a quote from the Old Testament? Is that an absolute direct quote from the Old Testament? Where does that take us? Page 1 of your Bible, Genesis 1:1, it starts in the beginning. So Matthew's prologue goes back to Abram. Mark's prologue goes back to Isaiah and Malachi. Luke's goes back to the apostles. John's goes all the way back to the beginning. In saying, who is this Jesus? He wants to get it clear from the very beginning who this Jesus is. So he goes right back to Genesis 1:1 and says, in the beginning was the Word. Well, that's interesting. Now, some theologians have lost their way with this word thing because the word in Greek, which is in what this gospel was written in, it was the trade language of the day, is logos. And the word logos in the Greek culture and Greek philosophy and Greek religion had all kinds of celestial meanings. And so some theologians have taken off on logos and said, well, this logos, what John is saying is, and go back into Greek philosophy. They have lost their way. Because where has John taken us at the beginning here? To Genesis 1:1 of the Hebrew Scriptures, and logos is simply the word for word translated into Greek from his perspective. So if you read some commentaries and they get into this logos thing, close them and put them aside. Because what he's talking about is not the Greek logos, it is the word that is meant in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is what is the source of creation in Genesis. God said, let there be. Boom, every day of creation. The word that was the source of creation. It is God's self-expression. It is God's creative word in action. In the beginning was the Word that began it all. Now it gets even more interesting. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. Wow, okay. The Word was with God, which means kind of separate, but there. And the Word was God, which means not separate. What this tells us right in the beginning is our God is a complex God. He's not a simple God. Simple gods are created by humans. This God was not of human creation. This is a God that is hard for us to understand. Does anybody here fully understand the Trinity? I don't. I believe it. It's awesome. It's our salvation. But 3 in 1, he's one God, not 3 gods, one God and 3 persons. And those 3 persons are one God, yet they are separate persons. Well, he alludes to that right here. In the beginning, this Word was with God and was God. Now, you may have heard, if you have the Jehovah's Witness people come around to your door, they have a different translation here because they don't believe Jesus was God. They say a God. So their Bible reads, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. And by the way, that is a legitimate potential translation of the Greek here because there's no article a in the Greek. The context will tell you whether it's he was God or he was a God. So it could be. So that's possible. Does the rest of what John says allow that to be true? The very next phrase was, he is in the beginning with God. Okay, right. Then we get to verse 3. All things came into being through him. And in case you didn't get it there, he gets a little more specific. And apart from him, nothing that came into being has come into being. In other words, he, this one we're talking about, the Word, created everything. There's nothing that's out there that he did not create. Now, when you say a God, you're talking about God small g. And by the way, that's a biblical context. There are gods small g. The book of Ephesians calls them powers and principalities and rulers of this world darkness. You can call them demons, you can whatever. Anyway, there are beings out there beyond what we can see, and they are called in many places God small g. So, was he a God? No, because those gods are all creations of God. God created all things. If you go to Colossians chapter 1, talking about Jesus Christ, Paul says that he created all things, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers, all things were created by him and for him. He created all gods, small g. He could not have been a God, small g. So a God simply is not allowed to fit in this, what he says here. What it does say is, this Word was nothing less than the Creator God. It cannot be made more clear, can it? John wants us to know who this Jesus Christ is that we follow. And sometimes we get hung up on this Jesus meek and mild, and yeah, he's a great teacher, and he says just love everybody, and yeah, true, but that's this much of the truth. The rest is, he is nothing less than the Creator God. In the beginning was the Word. And all things came into being through him. And apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. That's the first thing we want to see here is, this Jesus Christ who walked on the face of the earth was none less than Yahweh Elohim, the Creator God. Now, this is the prologue. John wants us to have this in our mind as we study this book. And we go through his life and see what he does and what he says, to keep in mind that that's who he is. And a reminder for us, that's who he is. This Jesus was God. But that wasn't all he is. He was certainly that. But then we get into some other interesting things. Verse 4, in him was life. We can stop right there. Where does science today miss it as far as we're concerned? We get hung up on evolution. You know what? Evolution is a fact to a certain extent. We know there is evolution. Otherwise, how could every type of human being come from Noah and his children? What God created is adaptable. And now, between species, that's where it gets a little tricky. But you know what science really misses it? From the very beginning point, which is purely naturalistic and says nothing but the natural world can exist. There can be nothing that exists that you cannot see, feel, touch, taste, whatever, which eliminates the very possibility of God. That's where it's missed. And also eliminates that entire realm of God's small g, powers and principalities, which they would say is just fairy tales and things. That's where it misses, though. What it says here is, in him was life. Where did life come from? Was it just the stuff out there that somehow came together with the right chemicals and the right compounds, and maybe lightning struck and it's alive and stayed alive and kept growing and reproduced, and next thing we have all this. Well, science answer is, boy, that's almost impossible. Given enough time, it's possible with what we know of evolution. So let's give it a lot of time. And I'm not here to criticize. By the way, science, let's not give it a bad name. Scientists do some very good work in our world, and they are very smart people. And their realm is to study this world, and they do a pretty good job of that. The problem is the presupposition that says creation created itself, which is really what Paul describes as our problem. We worship the creation instead of the creator. And by the way, scientists, true scientists, they worship this creation. I mean, they stand in awe of what they're studying because it's awesome. It's a reflection of God. But life came from the Word. It says it right in verse 4. In him was life. That's what started life. It came from God. He's the author of life. He's what makes things that are alive. The universe did not create, it did not come to life by itself. It did not create its own life. God did. And now here's where it gets really interesting. And the life was the light of men. The light, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. What you're going to see throughout John is a lot of talk about light and darkness and life. Life and light are themes you're going to see throughout here. They are beginning to be explained right here. Life came from God. It is ultimately that true life is the light of men. Now, what does that mean? By the way, when we see men, we're mature enough to know it's talking about humankind and not the gender of maleness. So we're mature enough to not have to worry about these words, reinforcing these things that, will oppress women by just using the very words. No, we get it. This is humankind. We're not talking about men. We're talking about humans, okay? In him was life. The life was the light of humans. You go back to Genesis 1. What is the crowning glory? What is the grand finale of God's creation? It's us. It all built up to us. We are the one in all creation of all created beings created in his image, which really means to be his imagers, to reflect his image, to reflect his glory. That's why he created us. He created us to be the light of his glory in this universe. Think about that for a while. In him was life, and the life was the light of man. When you let that sink in, you begin to realize just how devastating it was when mankind rebelled. That's how devastating the rebellion was, because of who we are created to be. The very light of life in this universe. In other words, the light of life became darkness. That's the tragedy of the fall of mankind. The light of life became darkness. And the whole rest of the Bible tells about how this God sought to rekindle this light of life in us. Why was God so patient? Why didn't he just kill Adam and Eve? He told them, you do this, you're going to die. He could have legitimately, righteously done what he said he was going to do. Why, when mankind got so dark that he decided this whole thing we need to start over here? Why did he save a family? Because we were the light of life, created to be that. Why did he stick with Israel through all those years and continual missing the point, and continually going the wrong way, and continually rebelling, and continually forgetting? And why did he come and die for us? It was to rekindle that thing for which he created us. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. So what is the Word to do? He has come to shine that light back into the darkness. And verse 5 says, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Not the best translation. The darkness did not overpower it or overcome it. The darkness ultimately doesn't win. With our Creator God, the darkness, no matter how dark it is, the darkness will not win. He is not only the creator God, he is the light of life. He is the author of life, and he created us to be his imager. But we have turned to darkness. Then he moves on to John. The last thing the Old Testament had to say was, the next thing you're going to see is the messenger who's going to come to prepare the way for the Lord who's going to come after that. So all these Gospels really start with John. They start with John when it gets past the prologue, and this one does as well. But evidently there were some people when John was writing this that were making a little too much of who John was. So he says, there came a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. So that's just a little parenthesis in his talking about who Jesus is and saying, now make sure you know who John is. He came to testify to the light so that all may believe, but he wasn't the light. Verse 9, there was the true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man, rekindles that for which we were created, to be the imagers of God and to shine his glory into this creation. There came the true light, which coming to the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, but the world did not know him. Here's the interesting thing about his coming. Creator God, the one who made everything, creator of life, came to this planet, but he was disguised in plain human flesh. He didn't come in glory. He didn't even come as somebody special. He didn't come as a superhero. He came as plain, ordinary human flesh. And so when he came to his own, the world didn't recognize him. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, but the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him, did not welcome him, did not recognize who he was and give him the welcome he deserved. Now, what would be the welcome he deserved? Creator God has come to visit us. We would fall on our faces before him and worship him and seek to do whatever his will would be. We didn't recognize him. We did not receive him. They expected something different. The expectation, even though it was told he was coming, the messenger will come, that's your clue. After that, the Lord will come to his temple. They were looking for something more glorious, something more victorious than plain, ordinary flesh that ends up being killed, letting himself be killed, although innocent. That was not what they were looking for. Verse 12, but as many as received him. He came to his own didn't receive him. But there were a few who did receive him. By the way, we've seen in those prophets of the Old Testament, there's always a faithful remnant. No matter how bad Israel always was, there was a faithful remnant, usually very small. He says, you know what, we're still in that faithful remnant business. He came to this world, didn't recognize him, wasn't received, but as many as did receive him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, which is, by the way, what we were created to be originally. He gave us the position of our original creation, God's children, those in close family relationship with him, to be imagers. By the way, kids, you are imagers of your parents. Did you know that? You are. You're imagers of your parents. You show. You don't only look like them, you've been raised by them. You reflect their glory, or lack thereof. You didn't get to pick them either. That's the other thing. But this is, we are given the gift of being children of God, imagers of him. That's for which we were created, even to those who believe on his name. And not only are we given that right to be adopted, in a sense, as his children, but we are given a new life. That light has shined back in. Remember, he was the life, and the life was the light of men, which has gone dark. That life is coming back into us, as well as that light. born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. He's making this very, very clear that it's not a human birth, it's not human effort, and it's not human wisdom. That's really what verse 13 is saying. Not human birth, not human effort, not human wisdom, but born of God. That is why he came. To receive him is to believe and to be born anew by God, the darkness relit. The darkness relit. That's why he came. That's who this is. And the conclusion of this part is, verse 14a, I'm stealing one phrase of your section, Andy. The Word became flesh. Make no mistake about it, we are talking about Jesus in all this. He is the Creator God. He is the light of life. He enables us to be what we were created to be, what his design was for us, and he has come to us in the flesh. The Word became flesh. By the way, I'm teaching the high school class. This is the class I'm teaching is Christian worldview. This is where Christian worldview starts. Who are we? What is this world? And who are we? And what is life all about? I think the class might be joining your Sunday school class, Andy. I think this would be good to finish out. We're not done with the prologue yet. Andy's going to finish the prologue. We're not even done. The crescendo is yet to come. In these next 5 verses, there is a lot of really interesting stuff that reminds us, who is this one we worship? Jesus Christ. So, get some coffee after we're done here. Go sign up for some small groups. Hang out with some really cool people. And come back in here. And we'll finish this prologue today with Andy teaching us. And then stick around for the potluck since you've stayed that long. But let's pray, shall we?